Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So we want to bring you something hopeful and helpful for your everyday life. Whether you've been following Jesus for a while or you're still trying to figure out exactly what you do believe about God. Now, you'll find on this podcast things that'll help with conversations about marriage and parenting and mental health and work, practical things to help you in your faith journey, and a lot more. So whether you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app or you're watching on YouTube, be sure to follow and subscribe so that you don't miss any of the hopeful and helpful conversations.
Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. I'm so excited that you're listening today for the final episode of 2024. Hard to believe that we've already made it here. But in this episode, I want to get you set up and ready for something that we're kicking off as a church to start 2025, which is the 21 days of prayer and fasting. On January 6th, that's Monday, we'll be starting the 21 days of prayer and fasting. We send out a text once a day for those 21 days with a little bit of a guide to help you direct your prayers in a way that it's going to help you connect with God better and just kind of grow your relationship with Jesus. And the whole premise and principle is really based on this idea of starting off the year by giving God the first and just watching as how he just blesses the rest and helps grow our relationship and our connection with him. And a big part of that is fasting, which comes with lots of questions like what type of fasting do I do and what exactly is fasting and how does it help? And so to do that, I have a conversation between Brodie and I where we dive into the question of fasting, and I think you're going to gain a lot from it. Before we do that, I just want to encourage you either right now, after this podcast episode, during it sometime, if you text the word pray to our number, 833-504-8665, 833-504-8665, text pray, and you'll be signed up to join us on the 21 days of prayer and fasting. I really hope you'll do that because I really do. I know I personally have experienced it being really impactful, and I know you will as well. So to get this year ended and started off right, here's my conversation with Brodie. Are you a New Year's resolution guy? Do you make New Year's resolutions?
You know, I used to be a bigger resolution guy, but now it's more like specific things. I do more like, hey, what am I going to do this year? Particularly because I'm a golfer, I really start to plan out how I'm going to take some steps forward in that. Mm-hmm. And then we as a family, we do a year in review. And we go back through month by month through the previous year and say, hey, what happened? What was good? What did God do? And then what are we kind of hoping for a little bit out of some things that are already planned, but not like, hey, I'm going to lose 20 pounds because even if I lose 20 pounds, it's probably not going to make the difference that I want it to. So how about you?
Yeah, I think I don't do like traditional resolutions. I think there have even been times where I'll start my okay, what do I want this year to look like after the first? Because I feel like the mentality of if I don't start it on the first, I failed is a bad mentality. You know what I mean? Like, yes. Well, I've already eaten my third slice of pizza at 12:02 on New Year's Day. You know what I mean? Like
that's stellar right there, man.
Well, yeah, I know. Live long, right?
Yep, exactly. But yeah, not a huge resolution guy.
Yeah, but I do goals, and I'll do. I kind of shift between two types of goals. Maybe there'll be specific things that I really want to accomplish. Like last year, it was like, I really want to run a marathon, and that was the year to do it. So that was kind of like my big goal. But also something that I've heard really popular coming into these days is like, they're called be goals. So like, who do you want to be? And then using that as like a element. So it's like, okay, I want to be a person who is, faithful. Or something like that. I want to be a healthy person. And so if your goal is to be healthy, that might shift some of your mentality. And so it's like, okay, I want to be healthy.
Yeah. Well, or I want to be kinder, and, you take opportunities as they come. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. I mean, okay. So our topic today kind of transitions somewhat loosely into that, where we kind of had a goal as a church where we wanted to really encourage people to take 21 days, just kind of start the new year, take 21 days to pray and fast. And obviously a big part of that, I think a lot of people very familiar with the concept of prayer in general, like they've at least it's very like, but fasting's a little different. Although kind of more modern now, there's like kind of very popular diets that revolve around fasting and things like that. So maybe people have had a little bit more exposure to that. But I'd love to chat with you a little bit today about just, okay, well, what does fasting look like? Maybe we can dispel some preconceived notions. Some people, maybe they're in day 7 of this. Let me just say real quick to everybody, join us, spend 21 days. It really, like, we'd love to have you do it with us. But whenever you hear this, if you want to do the 21 days of prayer and fasting, whenever is right for you, whenever like you're hearing this, join us and do it. Or maybe use this conversation as a way to like, oh, okay, maybe I did the prayer part, but now I have a really better understanding of fasting. And so now I'm going to dive in for a portion of time to do that. So, yeah. All right. Well, then let's dive in. So maybe just start off, when you think of fasting, okay, what comes to mind? Is there anything that kind of jumps into your mind right away? Do you feel like there's preconceived notions about it? Like, what do you think of when you hear fasting?
Oh yeah, I think there's plenty of preconceived notions. Some are scary and some are just funny. What the first thing that comes to my mind is headache right now, because I have given up caffeine for January and my head hurts. But in the end, I mean, some people are like scared of that type of thing, or they're like, I don't really want to do that. And I think that when we step into a thing called like fasting, some people think maybe it's a command. Some people think maybe that's just for people back then. Or, hey, I don't want to stop eating and drinking because that seems to be scary. There's some people that have had things in their past, eating disorders and other things that have come up in their lives, that they're like, well, this is scary because it might set me on a trail that I don't want to go back down. And so I think there's a lot of different things. What I think of, because of the last few years just really starting to think more deeply about it, is how do I move something out of my life that's important to me for a certain period of time, so that I can give God more space to be heard, to work, to challenge me. And it's not a whole year. If I had to give up caffeine for a whole year, there's no way that it would happen. But for a short period of time, for me to go, okay, when I'm feeling kind of those urges or whatever, maybe moving that thing aside to give God more space to speak in my life and I'm ready to pay attention is a helpful thing. And I think you see that throughout the scriptures, is that when the people of Israel were challenged to do that, they were in a spot where they needed God to speak and he needed them to listen. And so he would challenge them to set some things aside so that there was a better connection.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting. A lot of times it's like totally fine, good things, right? Like, so like a fast wouldn't necessarily be like, abstaining from something you probably shouldn't do anyway, right? It's like, I'm going to give up lying for my 21 days of prayer fasting. It's like, okay, well, appreciate that.
Maybe you should give it up longer.
But I think that goes to, it's not like a vow of stoicism. There we go. Really throwing that one out there.
Stoicism. Wow.
Yeah, I know. We can. That's a future podcast episode. But it's this, like, I love that mentality, right? Of it's like, okay, how do I give up this thing for this time period that says, gosh, I want to connect better. And I know that when I do this, the reason why it helps me connect better is because maybe it's craving. Maybe it's that headache. It's that thought that pops in your mind. Oh, I want this. You know what? I want more. Yeah.
That's actually a great way to look at it, is what do I want more right now? And I think then that gets into helping me evaluate what things have control of my life. And that's one of the things. Richard Foster, you can read all his stuff, but he's written, I looked at an article that he wrote, and he said, fasting helps things come to the surface too. It's not only that I get to listen to God and he gets to speak to me, but things that are important to me in my life that may have a controlling influence, they start to surface. Because if I decided, hey, I'm going to fast from television, and that's 2 or 3 hours a night for some folks, maybe even me when there's sports on, and you're starting to sit there and go, okay, what do I do with myself now? You realize that you've let something take over a big part of your life that you didn't even realize had control.
Yeah. That's interesting, because that's a next step level, right? Where it's almost like this space, like you're like providing yourself space from this habit, this whatever it is. And I think this would be a good point to mention. Like, I think traditionally I think of food when I think of fasting, but that's not always the case, right? Like, I think, I mean, honestly, what I think of for the longest time, I thought of fasting, I thought of the like monks, right? Where like they're not going to eat anything and they've taken this vow of silence, which maybe some people would love if I took 21 days of silence.
I know there's some who would like me to do that.
You agreed too strongly on that one, Brodie.
Oh no, I was thinking about me.
Oh, okay,
Gotcha.
Me. Fair enough. And so I think that's a great alternative, because you mentioned like if there's inhibitions, and we can dive into this more when we talk about types of fasting, but don't feel like, if you're hearing this, don't feel like, well, I can't do this because of this dietary concern, or I can't do this because of this. Maybe it is a preconceived notion. And you know what? Taking on like a food fast would feel like would carry some weird legalism or things like that with you. And if you need to do a different type of fast because that's your faith journey, great. Anything that's that separation that helps you connect better.
Yeah, it's where I've come back to. It's something that's core to who you are. Or even if you do kind of an evaluation of your habits and your rhythms and all those things, if there's something core to who you are, such as, hey, what if you put away your phone for 5 hours a day? There's some people who wouldn't know how to function. I dare say I'd feel a little bit lost sometimes, because you're like, everything goes through that. But when you say, hey, if I take something that's core to me, whether that's food, whether that's technology, whether that's something else, and I move that aside so that God can become more central for this season and I can hear his voice a little bit more clearly, that's what I think the purpose of fasting really centers around.
It's interesting. I was reading this, some comments about people, like what they thought about fasting. And some people like had this interpretation that it was about like self-punishment, which I don't think it is that way at all. So could you speak into that it's not that? Well,
there's some wording in scripture, in like the King James version and things like that uses that term to punish yourself or something like that. But when you go back to the original language, it really is about limitation instead of like, I'm going to flog myself so that I can. That's just never been the character of God to say, hey, you hurt yourself so that I can be heard better. It's more like, hey, you need to clear space because I'm speaking all the time. It's just a matter of if you can listen. And so I think that when we start getting to a place where people are like, hey, this is a punishment, or this is something you have to inflict upon yourself, I think that's when you start to get into dangerous places. And usually you hear about that in an extreme case where somebody's using that to manipulate others. And so it's something you just got to be careful of, to say, God, to me, is never someone who operates in the extremes. He doesn't say, hey, you have to give up all food, or he doesn't say you don't have to give up anything. It's usually in the middle of those things, the balance and the rhythm of things, that he says, hey, here's how it's best to live. This is how I've created you to live best, not in this extreme or this extreme.
Okay, so maybe then we can dive into like some examples or types of fasts that people do. We kind of like brainstorm some quickly, because I think one of the interesting things is that a lot of biblical practices you might see, there might be listed out this great way of doing this thing, but there's actually a ton of different examples of different types of fasts, even in the Bible.
Well, I think there's the fast that comes to mind that everybody's scared of, is I have to give up all food and all water for however long amount of time, which
you want to be like Jesus, you got 40 days.
And I just don't know that we're capable of that. And yet, I mean, there are some places where a short period of time of abstaining from food, I'm a little bit more leery of the water thing, just because I don't know how helpful that is if you don't have somebody who knows how to do it, if it's just something you're trying. And so, but the food thing is what we think of most. And there's some people who do it different ways. There's some people who say, hey, I'm not going to eat from sun up to sundown. And there's actually some people on staff at the Ridge that are doing that. And right about 3:00, it gets pretty cranky around the office for those people because they're hungry. But it's one of those things where they're like, okay, I'm just going to step aside from food in this space. Some people do it for, they do the other. They do it from noon to 8 in the morning or whatever like that. So intermittent fasting fasting for a period of time from food. Also, there's folks that I know that are not part of the Ridge, but are just friends of mine that they've done it where they've shut off the TV for a month, like period, and said, hey, I didn't realize how much time I was wasting. And then they started to think about, okay, how long do I scroll on my phone and waste time? And I know a number of people, and including some in my family, who have said, hey, I'm going to give up social media and actually delete the app for the month because I found that I'm scrolling a whole lot. And then the question is, okay, if I've done that, or there's the Daniel fast where it's vegetables. There's some people who do things where they just don't do meat. There's all sorts of different options. And I think it really depends, again, what's core to you that you're saying, hey, this is important to me. I'm going to give that up. So mine for this month was any soda and caffeine, and then any fast food. And I am deeply in love with McDonald's French fries. And so this is hard, especially with McDonald's right up the hill from the church. So it's one of those things that you just sit there and go, okay, there's a lot of options in a lot of different avenues that you can look at. Again, it's back to, what do you do with the time that you create by setting something aside? That's the big difference. If you just set it aside and then you fill it with something else, then it doesn't actually achieve the purpose, and you're not going to walk out of it going, wow, that was a season where I really felt like I heard God speak in some pretty important ways. Or I felt like he brought me to certain places that I hadn't been before. And so it really is, what do you set aside? But then, importantly, what do I fill that time with that actually makes the difference?
Okay, I want to come back to the second part in just a second, because that's probably the most important part of this whole thing.
Yeah.
But I think maybe real quickly, if somebody is there listening and they're like, okay, but how do I personally know what to do? Would you have some questions that, like, if somebody, like, say, we'll use me an example. So I'm like, hey, Brodie, I'm not entirely sure what to do for the 21 days of prayer and fast, but I know I want to do something. What kinds of questions would you be like, oh, let me ask you about this or that?
Yeah, the first thing I would ask you is, hey, John, what do you lean towards? When you think of fasting from something, what would you lean towards? Because you might already have an inkling as to something that would be important to you. Yeah. The next thing I would ask you is, hey, what are some important things to you that are kind of core to your rhythms or to what you take in every day that could be set aside without it being detrimental to health or, your job performance and stuff like that. I mean, we got to take into account those things. Yeah. I would ask that question. And then I would ask you the question of, what would be a stretch for you? Because, I mean, I can give up social media and it's not a stretch for me because I just use it to keep up.
Fine.
I'm like, yeah, but there's sometimes when I would ask you, I say, hey, what's going to challenge you a little bit? What's going to maybe bring a little bit of inconvenience or a lot of bit of inconvenience so that you created enough space? Because creating space in our life doesn't come smoothly. Otherwise, everybody would do it. And so it's going to have a little bit of challenge to it. And so what would those things be? What would stretch you a little bit? And then just pick something and go with it and really give it a try. Because you don't have to wait till January to do a fast. You could say, hey, I'm going to do it now. I'm going to give it a shot. And then in March, you could do it again and say, I'm going to try this a little bit differently for a season and see what comes of that.
Yeah. And man, that's really good stuff. I think that's super helpful because I think that's very practical questions. Like as much as you'd love to be able to just give a blanket, as much as we'd love there'd be like this blanket, everyone just do this. It really is unique to individuals, and which is a cool, I think, representation of like how people's faith are different and unique to them. And like best practices for an individual is not going to be universal for everybody. And really kind of allowing yourself the freedom to have that differentiation is like, that's unique to your faith, right? Like you said, if it was like, hey, everybody, we're taking 21 days off of social media. For the person that's scrolling TikTok or Instagram all day, that's going to be significantly more, I don't want to say effective, but it's going to be significantly more...
maybe impactful, I think would be the word.
Yeah. Great. Yes. Perfect. Read my mind. Versus like you said, for you, where you're like, okay, well, maybe I'd think about that once a day or something like that, where it's like, okay, that wouldn't be uniquely to how God has wired you.
Right.
I also would like real quick just say for people like, if you say it's for a period of 21 days, okay, and this doesn't just diminish the like
obviously do your absolute best to like follow through with that situation. But if something happens one day, it's okay. Next day, just keep going. Like, it's not like, oh, I've ruined it for the rest of the time. Because ultimately the goal is still the goal. The goal is to connect with God and prioritize him. And we're going to have mess ups. And when we do that, we can still prioritize him.
Yeah, I think so. I think the term that I use is give yourself a little grace.
Yeah.
I mean, we're going to have points. And if you decide to give up caffeine and you got a big presentation at work where you're like, I just can't function. Okay. I mean, these are things that come up. I mean, a lot of times when the Israelites would fast and pray, it wasn't for 21 or 30 days. It was for a much more succinct period of time. And so I think there's a little bit of grace. I think there's a little bit of flexibility and really trying to figure out, have I hit the goal? Like you said, of, reconnecting with God, spending time in reflection and refocusing.
Yeah. Okay. So then let's talk about that second part of what you mentioned, where it's like, okay, well, what do you do with that time? What do you do with that? For me, I know one of my big things is like, okay, if I feel a pang of hunger or if I feel a craving, I do have some social media stuff. So I'm like, if I pull up my phone to like click on the app, okay, what do I do in that moment where I'm like, oh wait, no, I'm not going to click on that. What do I do with that response?
Yeah. I think the fear that I always had was, well, when I feel the hunger pains or when my headache is there, that I have to sit in silence in some sort of position and I just have to sit there and wait. And I'm functionally ADHD. And so that would just drive me crazy. And so I think that the thing that your goal is to do is to say, hey, God, I'm trying to create space here and I'm doing it the best I can because my brain's all over the place. But is there something you want to say to me? And that's kind of the habit that I have formed in these days, is when I have the space where I would normally be doing some of the things that I have decided not to do, that I just go, okay, God, I'm here. Is there something that you want me to be thinking about? Is there something that you want me to hear from you? And then I just need to sit a little bit and listen. It doesn't mean I have to be sitting still, but I mean, just allow my posture internally to be one of listening and then see what comes up. And sometimes it's nothing. Sometimes it's something. I know there's some people that are more specific than that, where they'll set aside that time and they'll be like, all right, I'm going to read the scriptures and I'm going to go through this section of scripture because I feel like that's something that God has been asking me to do. And I think that scripture speaks. I think that God speaks in a still small voice. I think that God guides our thoughts while we're sitting there. And, your mind can run any number of directions and so can mine. But I do firmly believe that if we say, hey, God, is there something you want me to be thinking about? Or is there something you want me to hear from you? That he'll step into that space when he's ready and there'll be no way to get around it.
I love that you bring up the listening, because I don't think that I naturally do that. Like inherent, like it's not like a very natural rhythm for me to just listen. I'm much better at speaking. So I think that's a really helpful reminder of like it's those things that create those reminders to listen. I know for some people, myself included, they'll be like, I call them breath prayers.
Yeah.
Where if something pops, like if that craving or whatever happens, it's like, okay, what's something I could say in the span of a breath that reminds me or refocuses me, right? And for specifically these 21 days have been just like, hey, God, I trust you. And because I think that's part of the heart of this. It's like saying like, hey, guess what, God, you're more important than my extra cup of coffee. You know what I mean? Like, and I trust.
There's a debate some days on that, but that's a hard fought argument. But yes, you're right.
Yeah. And so, maybe I love the listening. It may be a breath prayer. I also know that there is something to, the fancy term for them is intercessory prayers. The more common language is praying for somebody.
Yeah.
And we should talk about that. I know that's something that we see examples of in the Bible as well.
Well, I think that when you create space, obviously there's lots of things, but maybe even saying, hey, there's some people in my life, or there's some places in my life that I feel like really need God's involvement. And, I've got a friend with a health issue, or I've got somebody struggling with addiction, or, they're just going through a really rough time where they feel like they're in a dark hole and they can't dig out. And part of that solution is maybe it's my presence. Maybe giving up something would be me showing up for them, but it's also asking God to show up in real ways, not just to fix their problem, but actually to be in it with them, is sometimes really important and really beneficial, and can help not only ask God to do that, but it can change my perspective on maybe what my role is in their life. And so I think, those are definitely some spaces where the listening is one part, the talking is the other. Both are necessary.
Yeah. Also, as we go towards, Mark shared our vision goal a couple weeks ago to help 5,000 people find Jesus by the end of 2030. So it could be that this is a time where you're fasting and you're praying for somebody. You're like, wow, I really want God to move in their life, and I want to intentionally pray that he does, and will use me to do it too. So
that's one of the things I wrote down questions for each week for me this year for the 21 days. So this week was, hey God, I'm sitting here listening. What do you need to speak to me as a person? The third week, my question is going to be, all right, God, who am I not seeing around me that needs to know you, but I'm not even paying attention, and open my eyes. And I'm actually really fascinated by what that week is going to be, and maybe even beyond that, to say, okay, what have I completely missed? Because I consider myself a fairly observant person.
Yeah.
But to be able to have God open my eyes and say, man, you just completely brushed over that person, I think it's going to be really interesting and really helpful for me.
Yeah. Okay. So that kind of tackles, I think, hey, what is a fast? What can you fast from? What do you do during that time? Maybe we could talk a little bit about what would be a unhelpful or unhealthy or perspective on fasting, or even, hey, don't do this while you're fasting type of.
Yeah. I think the highest level of unhelpful is if we think this is a way to get God to do something. Hey, God, I'm going to fast for you. So this is what I need you to do for me.
Love a good barter.
Oh yeah. And unfortunately for all of us, God doesn't barter, and he's not a genie. And any of those things that kind of, we want to leverage something, so to speak. And so I think that becomes unhealthy, because then you're doing it for the wrong reason in the beginning. So your motivation to keep going is going to be hard, but then you're also going to be disappointed in God because he doesn't operate that way. And so now something that was meant to build a connection between you and God actually probably drives a wedge further into that relationship, because you're like, well, I did this for you. Why didn't you do this for me? And I think one of the things, if I can go down that rabbit hole for a second, is that I think if you catch yourself doing that with God, you should probably look at the other relationships in your life and see if you do that too. Where, hey, I'll do this for you, but I'm expecting something in return. Not that you're doing it with bad intent, but a lot of us get into that habit of expecting something in return, and then things are constantly a disappointment, or we build wedges in relationships even if we don't even realize we're doing it. So that's a little bit further down. So unhealthy is saying, hey, I'm using this to leverage God to do something for me. The second would be, hey, I'm doing this for God, but so that I lose 30 pounds or something like that. I think figuring out how to do it in a way that's really got the right motivation, and we're humans, we're a bunch of mixed motives, but being careful to do that. And then I think the other thing that would be unhealthy is if you're like, hey, this is what I should do. When you hear the word should come up in your vocabulary, a red flag should go up, because it's most likely not you or God putting that should on you. It's something around you saying, well, this is what I should do. This is what everybody's expecting me to do. And so therefore I'll do it. And I know there are people out there who they have eating disorders, or they're recovering from a health crisis, or maybe having a baby, or they're dealing with mental health type of stuff. And to take nutrition out of their diet and have it affect things, it's just not helpful. And so maybe it's time to look at something that's non-food oriented or things like that, because that's going to be a much more healthy way to go about it now. And that doesn't mean that sometime in the future, if you decided, hey, I'm in a good place because of my health in those different places, then maybe you could choose to do something food related. But right now, it's not the right thing. And so you got to give yourself a little bit of grace and a little bit of latitude to do something different for a while. And so I think when you get into all those places, it can get unhealthy real quick, and you just got to keep your eye on it.
That's a really good one. Just to talk on the should element, because I think that there are lots of things about our faith that sometimes can fall into this category. And as much as maybe we're like, oh, I don't really want this to be this way, but maybe it does need to just sit in a should for this time being, because I know that that's going to be the most helpful. That's going to be the most honoring or righteous or whatever your phrasing is behavior, right? So it's like, well, I know I shouldn't lie, whatever that thing. I use the lie example again, but I think it's a fair one. And so maybe you want to, and your motivation is wrong for not lying or not lying. Oh man. I apologize to everybody listening to that section. But, or even if it's simple, I know there have been times from my life where it's like, I don't necessarily feel this internal motivation to read the Bible. It's like, but I do know that it is what's best for me. And I do know that I probably should. And so I'm going to do it. Fasting is not that way. Right. Which is an interesting distinction, right? Because it's very biblical example of, of God, I think it's in Isaiah, where God's admonishing or saying, this is not good behavior. You're fasting for the wrong reasons.
Yes.
And so you're not going to see any fruit come from it. And so,
that was one of the things that Richard Foster said in a couple articles I read, is he's like, you got to figure out, are you really fasting for you, or are you fasting for God? And to create space. And I had to do a little bit of a check on myself with that one. I was like, okay, am I doing this so that I can say I'm doing this, like giving up caffeine? I can say I gave up caffeine and I didn't drink a Diet Mountain Dew for a month or whatever, and I feel good about myself then? Or am I actually setting this aside so that something better can happen? And so I think we all have to check our motives, because we're a mixed bag when it comes to that. Yeah.
Well, I think that's also a reason why Jesus tells us, hey, if you're fasting, it's not something to, I think there's different elements when this is not true, but for the most part, when you're fasting, you're not supposed to be like, oh, woe is me, everyone, like I'm so hungry and things like that. Like he says, like, hey, do not do this, because the reason why you're doing this is so that people will look upon you. It's very different in the context of our conversation, where you're like, we're sharing because it's like, we're hoping to help people in their journey. Yeah. The Pharisees that were like, oh, I'm so hungry, they were not being like, oh, I'm so glad that this is going to help this person over here.
Right. Well, and there's something to the fact that if you're fasting, like if you've got a group that you're a part of, or you and your spouse or some friend are doing it, there's a certain element of commiseration that's okay. It's just, I can't fast so that the thing I've decided to fast from is going to give me notoriety. That's kind of or draw some attention to myself. It's for a different purpose. And we just have to check ourselves on some of those things, because we can get in that space pretty easy. And it's just good to go, let me check my motives.
Love that. Okay, Brodie, any final closing thoughts as we kind of wrap up this conversation? We've hit a lot of good stuff.
Well, I think that to bring it down to a succinct phrase, there's a verse in the Bible, and it was actually my third grade teacher's diet verse, and it's he must increase and I must decrease. And I think it was funny when it was her verse, but for this type of season to say, okay, what parts of me, what rhythms, what things that I do could decrease for a period of time so that he can increase his influence in my life. I think that kind of capsulizes the whole concept.
Yeah. Well, that was my conversation with Brodie. And if you want some more tools for learning about fasting and how that can help your faith and maybe some guides on how to pick the right one, go to theridgecc.com/21 days. You can find that as well as the prayer text in to join us for 21 days of prayer and fasting. But if you're curious, just once again, it is just text the word pray to 833-504-8665. And we're all going to be going through this together starting on Monday, January 6th. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Ridge Podcast. And I hope that you will like and subscribe, maybe even share this with a friend who you want to join you with 21 days of prayer and fasting so that you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Thanks and Happy New Year.